and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the best romantasy or fantasy romance books and where I think you should start if you're new to the genre, which ones have good spice, and which ones are my personal favorites. Before we get into today's video, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I greatly appreciate it if you subscribe. It helps me out a lot. So, if you are new to fantasy romance and you're coming from a high fantasy world where there is more world building, a good place to start would be Song of Blood and Stone by Penelope. This is a really cool book. The romance does take kind of center stage in the second half of this book, but there's some really great world building. This is a really great fantasy world, fantasy landscape. In this book, we follow Jasminda. In this world, there are two warring nations that are separated by a magical veil, and Jasminda comes home one day to find an enemy soldier, and she ends up helping him. This is really great because the world building is really good. The way the author built this world is stellar, and also it's a good romance. There are a lot of characters, there's a lot of moving parts. This sort of reminded me a little bit of N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season in that there's kind of like this Earth Singer vibe. It's a really cool magic system. I really enjoyed this and I am looking forward to continuing this series. It's a 4-book series and all of the books are currently out. Another series that I think is a really great entry point into romantasy is A Broken Blade and a Shadow Crown by Melissa Blair. These books are a really great story. They're not doing anything sort of like new as far as like plot wise or magic system goes. This is a classic Fae story, but Melissa Blair does a really great job with her characters, and I love all of the characters that are in this book. In this book, we follow Kira. She is the king's blade, meaning she's kind of like his personal assassin, and she is sent on a mission to kill the Shadow, who is sort of a Robin Hood type figure, and she ends up finding him and things are not as they seem. It sort of starts this like chaos of Kira wanting to bring down the monarch. This is really great. This is a really great book, especially because Kira, our main character, struggles with addiction, and I think that Melissa Blair did a really great job like conveying the difficulties of that. These books are really great. Spice in these is pretty chill. There's only kind of like one scene, and it's a real enemies to lovers scenario. So these are really, really great. The third book in this series is coming out this year, and I believe there's going to be 4 books total. If you're looking for a fantasy romance that's a little bit on the cozier side, my suggestion would be Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries. This was one of my favorite books of last year. I absolutely adored this book. In this book, we follow Emily Wilde. She is a scholar and she is working on her encyclopedia of all of the different kinds of fairies. She's almost done, and she goes on an expedition to a very wintry landscape to complete her research on different types of fairies. Her academic rival, Wendell, shows up. She assumes that it's because he's there to steal her work, but he's there for other reasons. And this was so good. If you like kind of a classic Fae tale where the human is able to outsmart the Fae because of their own like archetypes, their own like issues around like wanting to have a good story, this is the book for you. And the romance between Emily and Wendell is just, it's so cute. It's so funny. There are slightly higher stakes in this, so I don't know that it's actually cozy. I'm going to call it cozy adjacent. This was spectacular. If you're looking for a good fantasy romance that has no spice or that is YA, I will always suggest Margaret Rodgerson's An Enchantment of Ravens and A Sorcery of Thorns, or Tress of the Emerald Sea. Tress of the Emerald Sea is also cozy adjacent, similar to the Emily Wilde. I've raved about Tress loads, but I think this is a good intro to fantasy romance because it's not super romance heavy. It's a really great story with a really cool magic system. If you're looking for something a little bit more romantic, An Enchantment of Ravens or A Sorcery of Thorns is a great place to start, especially if you enjoy YA. These both have little to no spice because they're YA. Hello. And the story in both of these is really fun. If you're looking for a fantasy romance that has really great court politics, it has really good world building, dark magic, and possibly a love triangle, I recommend The Foxglove King. In this book, we follow Lore, and Lore has death magic. If she were to get caught using her magic, it could mean her death. And she's also a drug runner for a cartel. And one day she gets caught by the king's guard and is taken to the king, and she assumes she's going to be put to death, but instead he asks her to spy on his son for him. And this was really great. This is the first in a series. The sequel is coming out this year, but there's really great world building in this. The world building happens up top, and that causes the beginning to be a little bit slower, but the second half of this book is absolutely nuts. And it has a love triangle, which if you had asked me about a couple of months ago, I would have been absolutely not. I'm not into that. But however, this book does it really well. I really like Hannah Whitten's writing style, and this was a really great fantasy romance. If you're looking for a really good classic fantasy romance, I would recommend the Bridge Kingdom series. It's easy to access. It's free on Kindle Unlimited. And if you have Audible, the audiobooks are free on Audible. And it's just a classic fantasy romance story about a princess who has been trained her entire life to be a spy, and she ends up spying on the king of the enemy kingdom, and things go awry. It's just a really good classic fantasy romance tale. Another great fantasy romance. This one has a little bit more spice, so if you're looking for something a little bit more of that quality, I would recommend The Serpent and the Wings of Night. This book is so good. The stakes are so high. It's so well written. It has a really great magical competition, deadly competition that sort of moves the plot along. I really love the characters in this. The Serpent and the Wings of Night is excellent. It's vampires, it's humans, it's enemies to lovers, and it's really good. I do have to mention that the sequel, Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, is not nearly as good as this one, but it did complete the little duology within this book of 6. So it is worth the read if you really enjoyed this one, but it is not nearly as good as The Serpent and the Wings of Night. If you ask anybody else if they think that this book is a romantasy, they're probably going to say no. But I think it is, and that is Silver Under Nightfall by Chupeco. I love this book. I think about the characters in the world quite often. It's a very dark and gritty world featuring Remy, who is a vampire hunter. He's our main character, and he hates vampires because he thinks that they're terrible, but he meets 2 vampires that sort of change his opinion. The first half of this book is kind of a whodunit, okay? We're following along with this sort of murder mystery-esque scenario. The second half of this book turns into a beautiful polyamorous relationship between Remy and the 2 vampires, and I just think this book was great. I think that it was is really well written. It's a really cool fantasy world with a really wonderful romance. And I am looking forward to the second book in this series, Court of Wanderers, that's coming out this year. And finally, quite possibly my favorite fantasy romance. I think this is incredibly well written. The magic system is very cool. It's a duology. It is complete, so you can binge both books. That is One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns. These were some of the best books that I read last year in 2023, and I thoroughly recommend these. These are so highly recommended. Everybody has been talking about these books lately, and that is for very good reason. In the first book, we follow Elspeth, and Elspeth has magic, and that is kind of against the rules of the kingdom that she's living in. She has a monster living in her head, and that's kind of her magical power. She meets a highwayman, and her life takes a drastic turn. I love the characters that, just thinking about it, you know how sometimes you think about a book and you think about the characters and you're just I love them so much. I love these characters so much. And the ending of this book, I read this last year and I reread it again this year. But when I read it last year, I was I have no idea how Rachel Gilig is going to come back from the ending of this, and she absolutely did with Two Twisted Crowns. This was such a good sequel. I almost think this was better than this one. It was really great. The pacing was really good. The world building continued. The character development continued. Two Twisted Crowns is a stellar sequel to One Dark Window, and this is my top fantasy romance recommendation. If you are wanting anything from fantasy romance, if you're wanting to touch your toes in, if you love fantasy romance and you're just looking for more recommendations, if you have never read a book before and you want something that's fun and exciting, this is it. This is your duology right here. It's 2 books. They're not super long. They're about 400 pages. These are so good. They're so good. Some honorable fantasy romance mentions would be An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir, Legendborn and Bloodmarked by Tracy Dion, A Discovery of Witches. I would check trigger warnings and make sure that you're prepared for a problematic relationship if you read A Discovery of Witches. Obviously, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, The Jessed Heir by Sarah Hashem, An Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri, Defy the Night and Defend the Dawn by Bridget Kemmerer, We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal, and A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed. So those were some of my favorite fantasy romance books, some that I consider to be the best. If you have any fantasy romance recommendations, please leave them in the comments. I would love to know. I love reading fantasy romance, and I would love to know what you guys are reading as well. Anyways, I will be back in the next video. Bye!